Welcome to the Company of Dads podcast, where we explore the sweet, silly, strange, and sublime aspects of being a lead dad in a world where men, who are the go-to parent, aren't always accepted at work, among their friends, or in the community for what they're doing. I'm your host, Paul Sullivan. Our podcast is just one of the many things we produce each week at the Company of Dads. We have various features, including the Lead Dad of the Week. We have our monthly meetups. We have a new resource library for all fathers. The one-stop shop for all of this is our newsletter, The Dad. So sign up today at thecompanyofdads.com/The Dad. Today, our guest is Dr. Amy Beacom, founder of the Center for Parental Leave Leadership and the author of the Parental Leave Playbook. Amy started in the field, really started the field of parental leave coaching when her first child was born 17 years ago. She started the center in a pre-COVID, pre-equal leave world. It grew out of a maternity coaching business where she worked with both companies and individual parents. And while she's been doing needed, serious work for nearly 2 decades, this post-COVID hybrid work world seems tailored to what she's been building around her consulting and coaching in this space. She's also a mother of 2 teenagers with a husband of 20 plus years. Amy, welcome to the Company of Dads podcast.
Thank you, Paul. It is a pleasure to be here. I am thrilled to get to talk to you today.
How does 2024 compare to 2014 when you started the center?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Night and day.
Which one's in the light? Which one's in the dark?
That's a different question. That is a different, oh man, in so many different ways. So in 2014, nobody was talking about parental leave. I was trying to educate around what do we even mean by those terms. Some people were talking about maternity leave. Very few people were talking about paternity leave. Nobody was talking about parental leave. It was a lot of hitting my head against a brick wall, just really trying to get the conversation to change and for companies to really understand that this wasn't only about a policy benefit, a paid leave benefit, which was the very beginning of that conversation starting. California was the only state at that time, if I'm remembering correctly, that had a paid leave program. And so most people were just barely starting to talk about paid leave. And I was coming in and saying, okay, yes, paid leave is a critical part of what we need in this country to support working parents, but it's only one part of it. That's the policy about time and pay. I sort of think of it this way. Every new parent needs 3 things. They need to know how much time, how much pay, and what forms their support come in. And so as we're paying attention to pay and time, which nobody was really getting in 2014, I was coming in and saying, well, let's pay attention to the person too. And what else was different in 2014?
But let me drill down there on those 3 things. You know, how much you're going to get paid and how much time you're going to get off. Those are things that can be codified in an HR handbook. They could say, okay, this is what, birthing parents get. This is what non-birthing parents get. But the other part is more nuanced and more interesting to me. And you're talking about support around leadership. But, as I look at that, I think of as it happens with, a lot of dads today, 30-something dads, they want to go out and take some parental leave. And if they're lucky, they have a manager who's supportive of them taking whatever the company allows. But not all of them are that lucky. Some of them have those managers who want to sort of, sit back and say, I remember what it was like when I was a young dad. I took a day off. And then I missed the following, 17 years. And, these are these absurd stories that we hear, and they're often told by those managers, not remorsefully, but almost like nostalgically or boastfully. How do you come in at the center and, train those managers to realize that, their life experience was just that, their life experience, and that perhaps that's not the best way to go about managing both men and women when it comes to parental leave today?
Well, I think what is interesting in there is you're asking, how do you convince people that this is worth paying attention to? And it's it's by giving them a process and a structure, which goes back to 2014. There was nothing. And I'm coming in and I'm saying, this is our most overlooked leadership development opportunity. How can we need to start paying attention to it? And so there's elements of human development to pay attention to, and there's then practical structural pieces. So when you go into a manager and you say, hey, you need to support this dad as he goes out on leave, you're talking about the emotional support, which is much trickier for most people to put their heads around if they're a dad who did leave 20 years ago, 30 years ago. You know, they're like you said, nostalgic. They're proud of that. There's sort of a boast in it. But when you go in and you say, how do we structure this for the company so this becomes easier on the team? This becomes easier on you. This becomes easier on the person going out on leave and coming back in. What are the elements they need to navigate through this very common process? This, you know, it happens to 80% of people in their career life cycle. They become a parent. How do you move in and out of work to make room for that? And structure it. So that's how I started the conversation. Like, what are the elements? Because through our research here and in Australia, we discovered that there's 10, what I call the 10 touch points, which is what the book is about, which everyone, no matter what their situation is, navigates through at some point or another. And so we broke the parental leave down into 3 phases: a preparing for leave stage, a during leave stage, and a returning from leave stage. And when you do that, it starts to become something you can navigate with clarity and structure. And that's really attractive to managers.
Does that structure take some of the emotion out of it? Does that structure take out some of the sort of the, you know, influences from behavioral finance and sort of our biases that we have? Does that structure make it something that's easier to follow and replicate across a company, whatever skills those managers may have?
So it absolutely makes it something that's easier to replicate and have across the company. Yes, but I don't think it takes the emotion out of it. I think it creates space for the emotion. So instead of saying, here's this nebulous thing you got to go figure out on your own, and oh, they might be sleep deprived, so good luck with that, right? Like, you're saying, hey, in preparing for leave phase, you're going to navigate through an announcement, through an assessment, through an, you know, acknowledging the transition in some way, right? You're going to do these very structured things. And in those things, you have opportunities for conversations that need to happen, which may include emotions. And this is how you deal with emotions that may come up during these very specific things. So it moves it away from feeling like this tsunami of unknown risk, right? To something that's easily navigable with education and training.
I'm probably wrong here, but I'll ask the question. Anyway, I think, you know, personal experience, there are few people in this world more overconfident than a first-time parent before he or she becomes a parent. And so thinking of this structure, preparing for the leave, okay, checklist, follow it, make the announcement, you know, put a list together, work with your team, got it. Go out on leave, X number of weeks. Hopefully the company isn't checking in with you beyond sending you food or something like that that you might need. But it's the coming back, which is so sort of idiosyncratic. Everyone is going to return in a different way. You know, one of our daughters was an easy sleeper. Another daughter, you know, didn't sleep at all. The third daughter, you know, had a different experience from that. And so you come back as a different version of yourself that's really hard to understand when you go out. So how does the manager, how does the structure support that mother or father when she or he returns?
It's you are absolutely not wrong. I think that is a very true statement. The way that I often talk about it is this short little phrase: the best way to plan your, so I'm going to blow my own quote. The best way to prepare for leave is to plan your return. And so what we're doing in that preparing stage is we're helping them imagine that future state and to plan for it. And that does not mean that the plan will go as according to plan, right? So the third touch point is action plan, which is the leave planning process. We have templates and tools that walk you through all three of those phases, and you're front loading it. You're doing all that planning with your manager. Manager and the parent and the team are working together to offboard, to figure out what's the best plan. And then they're making contingency plan A and contingency plan B, however far down they want to go. And what that does is when that parent then welcomes that child into their life and realizes, oh, wow, I really thought it was going to go this way, but here we are going this other way. They're already primed to have those conversations, to have created the whole setup as a conversation with their manager, as something that is going to be unknown and flexible. So that gives everybody involved the opportunity to say, oh, look, none of our contingency plans are what we thought, but we already were thinking there might be a contingency plan. So let's create this other version, right? Or, yay, great.
What's that? Give me an example of that. Not a theoretical example, an actual example of how that might work.
So for example, you're setting up your return plan, and your ideal plan is you're coming back on March 3rd on Monday, full-time. That's your ideal plan. And your contingency plan is coming back on Wednesday and then Friday that first week and for half days. And then I'm going to ease into it, right? So that's often what people are thinking as a contingency plan, is sort of a phased return, like to be able to grapple with something. But then all of a sudden the child comes in and they came a month early and they're in the NICU, and that parent needs to drive to the hospital twice a day, and they might be able to do work on their laptop, but they're going to be distracted. So what do you do in that scenario? And in that scenario, they've already been set up to be able to have a conversation with their manager and team and say, hey, I might be able to do 2 hours a week this week. Next week, hopefully more. I can try and log in when I get home. Whatever the conversation that needs to happen is, they're already set up to have it, because they've created that relationship and that structure with their manager and team ahead of time. I don't know if that's specific enough for you.
Who do you coach more? The managers, so they know how to respond to that conversation, or the individual employees, so they know how to, be proactive enough or to ask that?
Yeah. I actually really love that question, because it talks to where we are as a country right now. And the answer is we coach more parents, because they're the ones who they're the drivers of this. It's happening to them. It's personally important. We have not yet moved into the time in our country where it is seen by managers or companies who are paying for manager support as critical for them to have. So we have less managers. I think that is going to be changing this year. We do more manager training, where we're teaching them outside of an experiential learning of it happening in real time with a parent. So they're learning the basics. But in the coaching side of things, we're doing more parents. And there's a lot of cons to that, because
right. I just think of an example that has nothing to do with parental leave. It has something to do with parenting, and that is, one of my daughters, the teacher said, I'd like you to come for extra help and talk about this, and please come on this day. And, so she, scheduled it and got everything ready. And then she showed up, and he's like, oh, yeah, sorry, I got somebody else here. I screwed this up. And she went away feeling really deflated, because she's young, very young, and it took her a lot to go there and put herself out there. And so that was a moment where, I called up the principal and said, look, I don't want to, you got to have a conversation here. This is not good. You got to manage this teacher. This is not good. And I think of this, the equivalent of this, you've coached this parent. The parent is super prepared, as prepared as she or he could possibly be with so many unknowns, gets up the gumption to call the manager, and the call and the conversation doesn't go well. Now, the manager's manager may have had a different conversation. If she had a different manager, there may have been a different conversation. But this one manager is not fully equipped to know how to respond. What do you do in that case?
We're trying to educate the manager. So we're educating the manager through the parent. If we're not working with the manager, we're having to do that. And it is not ideal. our entire model is a manager parent aligned model.
Yeah.
It's the only way to do it, we believe, that when that manager, so everything in those TED touch points, we have a manager version and an employee version. So for example, the training on the announcement is for that parent is about how do you set the tone for your leave by the way you announce? How do you talk about this? What are the considerations you want to put into when, how, what order of people, et cetera, into your announcement? For the manager, we're teaching them how do you respond to announcements? What do you say? Do you say, oh crap, this is a horrible time, right?
I'm going on vacation. You screwed up
vacation.
my vacation.
Exactly. That's when I'm golfing. Or do you say, congratulations, let's get a time on the calendar and figure out the next steps, right? Right. So
That's always a good answer. Just say, congratulations.
Congratulations is the only answer. So, but it's very rarely the answer because we are not setting up our managers to know what to do here. It's this gaping hole in their development. It's, in fact, they're told by not telling them anything, we're making them assume they can't say anything at all. And so they don't because they're worried they're going to have a pregnancy discrimination lawsuit or, or even just say the wrong thing and feel awkward or embarrassed. It's a very, very tricky time for managers because the employee expectation is changing so quickly around what they feel entitled to in their jobs around leave, and managers aren't given the tools to keep up right now.
You've got this, robust, locked in, amazing offering. Was there a tipping point for you when you realized, okay, I may be passionate about it, but parents and people leaders, they're finally starting to, get what I'm telling them? Was there a moment? And if so, tell me what it was.
I think you can guess. The moment was the year of the pandemic when they realized what was happening around retention of moms and how when care became visible to the workforce was around the 2020 2021. Literally when people were sitting on Zoom calls and kids are running, that one clip of the dad on the BBC calls.
Amazing. He's got a whole website. That guy. He's an
Does he?
apologist.
Oh my God, I'll never forget
and
that.
the kids and the mom pulling the kids out. And
oh my God. I mean, I laughed. I still laugh about that.
Legend.
That was if there was a turning point, if you could point to a cultural moment, that would be when that video went viral because it was a dad and he's trying to work and the mom's like trying to pull up her pants and chase the kid in and the whole, you can imagine her trying to go to the bathroom and they got away from her and they're interrupting and
but it's not even like she's trying to pull them out. It's like these are like little assassins and they're going to kill them and she must save the father from his own children because they have poisonous hands. Poisonous hands. If they touch him, he's going to melt. Yeah. Oh, it's amazing.
But it's worse than that. It's that they can't.
Oh, he doesn't even flinch. He just keeps looking straight ahead. Yeah.
And the cultural moment that is, we're ignoring this entire backdrop that is allowing this man to be on this call and we're pretending this life doesn't exist, right? So that was the turning point. And companies started to get it from there.
Which is why, for those watching this on video, I have a deadbolt lock on this door behind me. So there's no way a child is, and a retina scan outside as well. But, pre-COVID, we had this fiction that people came to work, a kind of Milton Friedman, University of Chicago model worker, and they worked their time in the office. And the personal life was something that we sure they had, but we didn't really care because they were workers. A little bit of an exaggeration, but not too much.
Pretty much.
2020 happens. We're like, oh my goodness, there are kids everywhere. People are like, what's going on? This is chaotic. We would go sort of a year. There's another wave of COVID. People are still not, in and out. I get where you have this moment where, okay, we got to figure this out. How do we hear? But then companies have such haphazard and ill-defined return to work plans, hybrid plans, you must be here X number of days. And now there's so much, variability. And we've seen with, particular workforces that have 3, 4, 5 generations in them now, so many different, life experiences. How does that work? I guess to your advantage, or how do you see that as a way, like, okay, here's the opportunity, but in that opportunity, how do you make sure you're conveying best practices to managers and employees when there is so much variability in
Variability.
how people are working?
I think that is one of the benefits and brilliances of our model is it's not variable. It's across all generations um, and needs. It's built-in flexibility into a structured model. And we don't have that anywhere else. It's literally the only evidence-based parental leave framework to exist in the world. It's not, and so as we get further down the path, I mean, we're in a time of transition in our country around this. This is not something most companies are doing. This is something only the top companies are doing. When we started working in the US in, what was it, 2013, 14, it was with Microsoft, and they were one of the first companies to say, hey, we have to do this better. And they did not stop at a simple coaching program, or they brought us in to transform the way that they do leave, and they were expanding it into fathers. They were creating a one-stop hub for all of the resources. They were creating manager training based on our methods for 80 countries around the world. So it's not a small thing. And I think when companies are approaching this right now, it's still through HR as a benefit. And that's not what we're talking about. Parental leave is a strategic opportunity for the company,
Yeah.
and it should be part of leadership. It should be part of, L&D, DEI, HR, but really it's when the leader of that company or the C-suite decides this is impacting us on multiple levels. It's retention, it's productivity, it's health and wellness, it's suicides, it's, all of these things can come down to this very critical time point that we call parental leave, which is really that year of time of such massive transition for that employee, that if it's done right, great. They have a career, they're engaged, everybody's happy. If it's done wrong, they're falling out, there's lawsuits, it's a mess. So,
And if it's done really wrong, they put it all on TikTok, and then people
and
stop
then,
buying like the little baby bag thing, and that CEO looks really
and
mean.
the company goes down. I mean,
Yeah, the
it's
company goes down.
still brand, it's a branding issue and a culture issue. So,
You've been doing this at the center for 10 years, 17 years overall, thinking about leadership. I'm sure you know the work of Stu Friedman at Wharton. We love Stu. Everybody loves Stu. Who doesn't love Stu? But Stu got into this work in the 80s around gender equity and how the workplace was changing. And when he got into it, his colleagues at Wharton were like, Stu, what are you doing, man? Like,
I
you're on
know.
a
I
tenure
talked to
track
him.
at Wharton. Like, this is a big deal job. Like, don't screw it up. You're not in a XYZ central northeastern state. On a this is a big deal. He's like, no, this is important, and he's
Yeah.
right, and he's been right, and he's
Yeah.
had he took a just as like Nick Bloom at Stanford, did all this research on remote work and what it meant, and for years he toiled and like who cares about what this guy's doing, and now he knows it all. But
Add Brad Harrington in there too. Shout out to
oh yeah,
Brad.
we know Brad. Brad's been on the
Center.
podcast. Brad at Boston College, the Boston College Center. Brad is remarkable. He's trained some other good people.
Stu and Brad like started the
Yeah.
dad conversation, and thank goodness for them, because that's what gets listened to. And they have done more for
And
gender
why does that get listened to? Tell us why it gets listened to.
because of sexism.
Hmm.
Like, I mean, really, it's that simple. Misogyny, patriarchy.
And when you say misogyny and patriarchy, and agree with you, but is it that you drill down? Is it that the expectation has historically been in the workplace that women will have children and have to then balance their careers and figure it all out, whereas dads, who were obviously part of creating the child and parenting the child, they'll just go back to work like nothing happened? Is that a dumbed down version of how what the view has been?
It it is, but I think there's more nuance in that. It's that we haven't allowed dads to be caregivers in this
Mhm.
country. We haven't given them an opportunity to be equal at home. And so because of that early on split between the home is the woman's work and the paid work is the man's work, we just haven't recovered from that. We have, even though that's not really what happens in
Mhm.
most families. And so it's the more men we can get visibly taking their parental leave, advocating for structured processes so everybody's supported, the more it's going to help the women. The women are going to sit here and say this till they're blue in the face, but until it's more visible through the dads, we aren't going to have the progress that we need, and that's why I'm so grateful to Stu and Brad. I mean, they've really brought that conversation to the forefront.
And Brad's been on the podcast. Listeners may have heard this. Brad's work as I do. He tells the story where 10 years ago, when you were starting what you started, and he was starting what he started at Boston College, they floated the idea of giving equal leave to moms and dads. And these top companies that were backing the center said, sure, let's do it. And only after the fact did one of them have a conversation with Brad and said, this has been a really great policy. These dads are taking their leave. They come back more productive, happier. There's also not the disparity between, women going out for 20 weeks and men going out for 2 weeks. So we can, bake in some more equity into the workplace. But, I'm going to be honest with you. When we proposed this idea of giving leave to dads, we didn't think any of them would take it. And we thought it was a giveaway, and now they took it. And that was, to me, it's such a great story when Brad tells it, because it was a tipping point. How
Yeah.
has that worked into the work that you're doing, where it's not just moms have to, you just birthed a child, you're not going back to work then 2 days later, but how has that the rise of dads worked into the work you're doing?
It's one of my favorite things to see, because as soon as you change the policy to allow for it, it takes about a year until it's normed into the culture of the
Mm.
company. But at first, those dads are nervous. I mean, we did a big culture change project around leave at a big oil and gas company, and they had 2 days of leave for dads when we started, and they increased it.
Consecutive? Could you take them one
You
consecutively, or did you have to spread them out?
I'm just glad they had two at that moment. But because they had a lot of they have a lot of oil rig dads. They had a lot of dads. There was a whole spectrum of jobs that they had in this oil and gas company, of course. And they thought, we have a tough man culture. None of these dads are gonna take it. We're not gonna, nobody's gonna do it. And I and two other women in the company um, fought for it, built it, created it, changed the policy, and then started to educate around it and train the managers. And within the first 6 months, it was a little dodgy. It was like, oh, I can get X number of weeks, but I'm only going to take one. I don't know, they're testing
Yeah.
the waters. Are they going to be harmed by taking their full leave? Are they going to be made fun of? Are they going to be, whatever it is that was likely? And at first, there was a tiny bit of that, but as soon as it started to become the norm, like, why wouldn't you take it? You're getting, then within a year, when I had a conversation with the team again, they didn't remember that it had been an issue and that everyone had fought against the length of time that we were proposing. They were like, oh, of course the dads take the full time. And I'd been waiting for 6 months for the answer of like, are dads taking their full
Yeah.
time? And when I asked it, like on pins and needles, like, please, are the dads taking their full time? They're like, what do you mean? Of course they're taking their full time. I was like, oh my God, the fact that this isn't even a question to you just shows how quickly that culture can change and how important it was to the entire structure of that company. Everybody was happier.
How long was it? How long was the leave that the dads
Well,
got?
I don't want to embarrass them by telling
Okay,
you how
that's fine.
short it was, but it was
No, fine. Well, it's good
it
because
was
here's a,
less than the
it
moms.
was less than a month. But look, baby steps. We're getting there. Here's a question, and this is and Dr. Amy Beacom on the Company Dads podcast, amazing conversation. Here's a question I want to just thinking of that. You're an oil rig worker. I'm not deeply knowledgeable about this, but you can make a pile of money. You're out there and you can make a pile of money over time, and it is a dangerous job. And the whole fucking thing sets on fire, and it's full of oil. It's dangerous. But companies that I've talked to, they'll sort of say, sotto voce, in a little whisper to me, like, this is easier to do with salaried workers. Like, we can have somebody come in and fill in, but I don't want to say this out loud. It's really hard to do with hourly wage workers because then we're paying double as opposed to taking one person's work and spreading it out among 3 or 4 people. How do you, help people who are in companies with the preponderance of hourly wage workers come up with a parental leave plan that is equitable and still allows those workers who contribute tremendously to the company to benefit from something that, the executive of the salary gets?
Yeah, it's of course different by company. I mean, if that's a grocery store hourly worker versus a rig worker, those are different things. Like a rig worker, you've got skilled labor that is in high demand, and there's not a ton of fill for that. So it's part of the conversation. One solution for companies as they're considering how to do it is create rotating in-house like sub teams that come and fill in for different people when they're on leave. And just as a plug, because you mentioned that they're paying double because then they're paying the person on leave and the person going out. I just want to put a plug in. That all goes away when you have a state leave program or a federal paid leave program. Like the only reason companies are in that position is because we've shot ourselves in the foot by creating this patchwork of paid leave issues. So advocate for paid leave if you're in a company and that goes away in some ways. So your point is valid, though. It's more difficult. It just is more difficult. That doesn't mean there's not solutions. It just means you need to get creative about what those solutions are for your particular company. I guess is my short answer, knowing we don't have a ton of time.
Yeah, this is awesome. Dr. Amy Beacom, founder of the Center for Parental Leave Leadership and the author of the Parental Leave Playbook. Thank you so much for being my guest today on the Company of Dads podcast.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Company of Dads podcast. I also want to thank the people who make this podcast and everything else that we do at the Company of Dads possible. Helder Mira, who is our audio producer. Lindsay Decker, who handles all of our social media. Terry Brennan, who's helping us with the newsletter and audience acquisition. Emily Servin, who is our web maestro. And of course, Evan Roosevelt, who is working side by side with me in many of the things that we do here at the Company of Dads. It's a great team, and we're just trying to bring you the best in fatherhood. Remember, the one-stop shop for everything is our newsletter, The Dad. Sign up at thecompanyofdads.com/thedad. Thank you again for listening.